Okay, I'm back. So it's about 5 minutes past the top of the hour. We're going to get started, and folks will join us as we're in progress here in person or on Zoom as we're zooming along with the presentation. So to get us started, I'm first going to introduce Dennis Bartok. He is the Executive Director of the Philosophical Research Society, the venue that we're at tonight, and our host for this evening. Dennis?
Thank you. I just want to briefly welcome you on behalf of the board and the staff of PRS for Terrible, Thrilling, True, collecting the books, brochures, and ephemera of the Donner Party with historian and author Jim Hier. This is an event that I have discussed now for well over half a year with Kevin Kosick, Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and was very eager. I've actually been fascinated by the history, the lore, and the myth, the mystery attached to the Donner Party for many years. So I think I am as excited as anyone here to see this presentation. I just want to welcome you and our collaborative partners with the Book Club of California and turn it back over to Kevin.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. So again, good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California's live and online presentation titled Terrible, Thrilling, True, collecting the books and brochures and ephemera of the Donner Party by Jim Hier. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Kevin Kosick and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to kind of host the webinar and this event tonight. We have about 100 people registered on Zoom and about 30 who have registered to be here in person this evening. So for those of you who might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the history and literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and lectures like the one this evening on programs and topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. So if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you like what we do, you should consider membership. Membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members and our donors, so visit us online at bccbooks.org. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. Terrible, Thrilling, True, collecting the books, brochures, and ephemera of the Donner Party, delivered by Jim Hier. Now, Jim Hier has had a lifelong interest in American history, which he attributes to his father, a former teacher with the Los Angeles Unified School District. Hier graduated with a degree in history from Claremont McKenna College and retired after a 50-plus year career in financial services. He has written several history books and book articles related to, for national publications, as well as a book on the history of his hometown of Granada Hills, California, which was published by Arcadia Publishing in 2007. Among other interests, he has been collecting books on a variety of topics, including the Donner Party tragedy. He is currently working on a comprehensive bibliography of published presidential books and speeches. Tonight, the presentation is on the Donner Party. In the history of Westward Expansion, the Donner Party stands alone. Their history and their story has been the inspiration for a bounty of books and pamphlets, both serious and some not so much serious. The literary history of the Donner Party runs the gamut from histories, biographies, fiction, epic poems, plays, and even a cookbook. Now, after more than 50 years of collecting all things Donner Party, tonight our speaker will share items from his collection and discuss the literary legacy of the Donner Party. So if you have questions for our speaker, we're going to take them at the end. And if you're on Zoom, you can use the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom to post your questions and comments. We'll have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from both the chat and the Q&A. And if you're here in the room, you can raise your hand. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, author and collector, Jim Hier.
Kevin, thank you very much. Dennis, thank you for hosting tonight. Excited to be here. I actually gave this presentation in August of 2019, just before the pandemic set in. Kevin wasn't horrified by the content and asked me if I would consider doing it here in Southern California. I was happy to do that, and then we had the pandemic. So it's good to finally be back and be able to have the presentation tonight. The Donner Party, as was mentioned, to me is one of the most fascinating stories of Westward Expansion, the migration to the West in the 1840s. It is a story that really defies thinking because of everything that happened. It has heroes, villains, drama, hopes, and dreams, horrible things that happened. I've always thought it would make a great movie, but it's probably too epic a tale for a single screen. But the books do it justice, and there's a lot of them, and we'll be illustrating my talk tonight through some of the books and items from my collection. So why don't we get started? As soon as I can figure out how to advance this. Okay, there we go. The story of the Donner Party started, appropriate enough for this audience, with a book, Lansford Hastings' The Immigrant's Guide to California. And we're going to be talking about Mr. Hastings in a little bit. He's probably under the category of one of the villains of this story. But first, let me talk a little bit about my journey. How did I come here? How did I get interested in this? As Kevin mentioned, I was fortunate enough to have a father who was a history lover and a history teacher. Like most kids growing up in the San Bernardino Valley and here in LA, I became interested or heard about the Donner Party during junior high during our California history classes. But it really wasn't until a visit to Donner Lake in Northern California between my junior high and high school years that I became fascinated with the story. I also was lucky enough a couple of years later to have a good friend of mine from college whose folks had a cabin on the shores of Donner Lake. And so we would go up there several times a year. And while up there, I became interested in, why don't I need to get a book on the Donner Party, maybe a couple of them. And that's when my journey to book collecting started. On a side trip to San Francisco, went to the Old Holmes Company bookstore and bought my first couple of books. I tend to be, when it comes to collecting, what people call a completist, much to the chagrin of my family, but to the delight of booksellers around the country. And so I bought those first two, and I started asking questions, well, what other books are there about the Donner Party? Well, just so happens the Book Club of California published a couple of limited edition books. First one I got was the diary of Patrick Breen's diary, which is actually one of the more definitive accounts by a person who experienced what the Donner Party went through. And then a book called Donner Miscellany. These were limited edition books. I hadn't known what limited edition books were. This kind of got me interested. And so then I asked the question, well, how many more books could there be? You're about to find out. But let's start, I'll illustrate my talk with a story, a quick summary of the story of the Donner Party. The Donner Party started out initially really two families. the James Reed family of Springfield, Illinois, and the Donner family, which was two brothers, George and Jacob Donner, and their families. They organized their wagon train and prepared to move west. Interestingly, if Springfield in the 1840s sounds like didn't something happen there then? Well, it turns out that the Reeds were actually acquaintances of a fellow named Abraham Lincoln. And there was a recent book that came out that discussed the fact that Lincoln, very briefly, in 1846, toyed with the idea of maybe joining Reed on the trip west. He was always fascinated with California. But instead of doing that, he stuck around and decided to run for Congress. One can only imagine what American history would be like if Mr. Lincoln had joined the Donners. But it is suspected that Mary Todd Lincoln was among those that saw the Reeds and the Donners off when they left Springfield. It was a big deal back then to have these wagon trains, with friends that they'd never see again, leave with all these herds of livestock and wagons. And the Reeds actually had a magnificent wagon. It was larger by far than most of your standard wagons. It actually was a two-story wagon. It had extra suspension to make the ride easier, and a wood-burning stove on board. And it was hauled by at least 2 or 3 teams of oxen more than would normally haul a wagon. So they left in mid-April. It was a little late, but their plan was to actually leave so that there would be ample grass on the plains and readily available water from spring rains. Initially, they left with about 35, 36 people, and they headed to Independence, Missouri. In May, they got to Independence with basically no problems. They were still running a little late, but they weren't worried about it. Towards the end of the month, Sarah Keyes, who's James Reed's mother-in-law, passed away. She was ill at the time. They weren't sure she was going to make the trip. One of the reasons he built the wagon for comfort was for his mother-in-law. But around Alcove Springs, Kansas, she passed away. But they pressed on. Finally arriving at Fort Laramie in Wyoming in June. They had read Hastings' Immigrant's Guide. They were intrigued with the possibility of a shortcut for a couple of reasons. One, they were running late. And the idea of getting to California early was tempting, not only because they didn't want to get stuck, on their journey, but the reality was the sooner you got to California, the sooner or the better options you'd have in terms of available land and things like that. So there was a bit of a greedy aspect to it. But they pressed on. When they were at Fort Laramie, they actually ran into a famous frontiersman, James Clayman, who had just rode with Hastings, who, interestingly enough, left California around the same time that the Donners and the Reeds left Springfield to test out his cutoff, his recommended shortcut. He had written about it, but actually never been on the shortcut. So I guess a equivalent of don't trust everything you read on the internet. Don't trust everything you read in print. But the idea of the shortcut was still tempting, and they were still considering it. Let's talk a little bit about Westward Hastings. Interesting guy. He was an attorney, very ambitious. His reason for writing The Immigrant's Guide to California was to really bolster his political capital. He was hoping to attract enough Americans to then Mexican-held California to start an overthrow of the Mexican government, thinking if he was seen as the person who got people to California, that he stood a pretty good political chance of elevating himself. Fortunately for Hastings, expansionists like James Polk had similar designs on California, and they also had a much bigger army. So even though he was not successful in his efforts to attract a lot of people, Hastings stayed in California for a couple of years, actually was part of the California Battalion, and he served in the delegation for the California Constitutional Convention. Around 1850, he left and went to Arizona, where he became a territorial judge and ran a post office. And then, at the outbreak of the Civil War, he sided with the Confederacy. He actually had a meeting with Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis made him a major in the Confederate Army, and Hastings was supposed to try to restrain California from joining the Union. Nothing came of that effort. At the end of the Civil War, when thousands of former Confederates were looking to leave California, South America and the Caribbean became very attractive to them. And Hastings, again, sensing an opportunity, wrote a book called The Immigrant's Guide to Brazil. And he started trying to encourage former Confederates to go to Brazil and set up colonies in Brazil. Unfortunately for Hastings, in 1870, while escorting a group of immigrants, he caught yellow fever and died in the Virgin Islands. So that is the short life of Westward Hastings. Now let's get back to the Donner Party. As I said, the shortcut was becoming more and more tempting. They got to Fort Laramie on July 4th. The ideal time, the way you would time yourself on that journey west, was to get to Independence Rock in Wyoming by July 4th. That's the name, Independence Rock. Unfortunately, they were about 2 weeks behind schedule. Again, this Hastings cutoff is becoming more and more tempting. When they got to Independence Rock 2 weeks later, there was actually a letter from Hastings inviting the Donners and their group to meet him in Fort Bridger, and he would escort them through the cutoff. At that point, the decision was made. On July 20th, George Donner is actually elected captain. They decided to take the cutoff. And one of the things that's interesting about that is to get to the Fort Bridger, they actually avoided what was a successful cutoff, known as Sublet's cutoff. It had been established 2 years earlier on the California Trail, that had they taken it, they would have bypassed Fort Bridger and had a direct line to Fort Hall. But they rationalized, well, if we got to Fort Bridger and we felt uncomfortable, we could still go back up to the old California Trail, get to Fort Hall, and complete our journey. Bridger obviously had a selfish interest in getting more of these immigrants to come through his fort. It was really a small settlement, a trading post, that he was losing business for the last 2 years because of this sublet cutoff. And so he was advocating anyone that would listen, take the Hastings cutoff. It brings you right through Fort Bridger. So when they got to Bridger, Fort Bridger finally, it was July 20th, Bridger is assuring them, oh, the route is fine. You have nothing to worry about. Well, that was not true, and we'll find out more in a minute. Who exactly was the Donner Party? Well, it was made up of several families, chiefly as I said, George and Tamsin Donner, and George's brother Jacob and his wife Elizabeth. They were one of the leading families. They had been an important family in Springfield. And Tamsin Donner has been the subject of many books. She's a very tragic yet heroic figure in the telling of the Donner story. One of the books that came out at the turn of the century was actually a book by one of the Donner children. Historically, it's not particularly accurate. She was only 3 when she experienced the tragedy in the Sierras, but it's still considered to be an important book. One of the other families was the Reed family. We talked about them already. James and Margaret Reed and their 5 children. One of the more well-known members of the Reed family is Patty Reed. And there is a child's fiction, a book called Patty Reed's Doll, talking about Patty's favorite little doll that she, during the troubles in the mountains, they had to abandon all their belongings. But she kept that doll hidden and was worried a good chunk of the time that maybe she had caused all the calamity because she didn't obey her parents and get rid of unnecessary things. But so Patty Reed's Doll is a favorite child's book. Another family was the Breen family. I mentioned already the Breen Diary. A good day-by-day accounting of what unfolded on the mountain. The Breens were they were a big Irish Catholic family and had several family members with them. There was also the Graves family. Found out that tonight we actually have descendants of the Graves with us both on Zoom and here in the audience. So welcome, thank you. The Graves family was a large family. It had a number of people, both family members as well as hands and laborers that were teamsters that were part of their group. And they played an epic role in the ultimate rescue of the Donners. Actually, when the Graves were the last family to join the Donner Party, and they did that after they left Fort Bridger, and that brought the total count of the Donner Party to 87 people. A couple other families, probably one of my favorite characters, all very tragic. William Eddy and his wife, they had 2 young children. Eddie went through some just heroic efforts to help save everyone in the party, and sadly was not able to save his family. Louis Keysburg, who people have no doubt heard about, we'll be talking about, his wife. They had 2 children. Some of the other families were the Murphys, the Fosters, the Pikes, McCutcheon, and Wolfinger was the indulgent family that was with that made up the Donner Party. As I mentioned, there were about 87 people. That's kind of the final count for the Donner Party. The decision to take the cutoff was actually made in late July. I mentioned some of the reasons already. Possibility of getting better land, obviously, getting across the mountains, which was a known problem, and the sooner you got across, the better. But they also were under the impression, by taking the cutoff, that they'd save anywhere from 350 to 400 miles, and they would. By the time they left Fort Bridger, they should be safely at Fort Sutter in Sacramento in about 7 weeks. Sadly, that did not turn out to be the case. In advance, prior to their leaving, a journalist named James Bryant had viewed the cutoff, heard about the Donners and the Reeds, and wrote letters to them to avoid taking Hastings Cutoff. It was not going to be the solution they were looking for. For some reason, those letters were never received. And it is suspected that either Jim Bridger or maybe his associate, a guy named Louis Vasquez, may have kept those letters from reaching the Donner Party. Because Bryant was warning them off. So, when they left Fort Bridger, they were fully invested now in the cutoff. There was really no turning back. And frankly, the first couple of days, it went fine. They made good time, and they were very pleased with themselves for having made the decision. It was actually right after they left Fort Bridger that the Graves family joined them. Unfortunately, that happiness didn't last. When they got to the Wasatch Mountains, I don't have a timer about this, but when they got to the Wasatch Mountains, they got to an area that had never had a trail cut through, where they had been making anywhere from 10 to 15 miles a day on the California Trail. It took them 16 days to travel 36 miles. They had to cut and fight for every inch of the trail. And when they finally broke through the Wasatch Mountains, and they got to a point roughly around Park City, Utah today, they realized they were not done. They still had to cross the Great Salt Desert, just south of Salt Lake, near the Bonneville Salt Flats. They were told to prepare for that journey, that it would be a distance of about 40 miles, and it should only take them a couple of days. Well, it turned out to be 80 miles, and it took them nearly 6 days to cross the desert. Halfway through, they lost much of their livestock. Animals broke away looking for water, couldn't find any, and the Reed family alone lost half the livestock they brought with them, just in the desert crossing. They also, when they got to the end, to the other side, actually not fully to the other side, but a spot where there was a freshwater spring, they decided to regroup, realized they couldn't continue on their way, abandoned much of their belongings. The Reeds, for example, went from 3 wagons to 1. They left behind their grand Pioneer Palace, the 2-story wagon we talked about before. Most of the settlers cached most of their belongings, bringing with them only the essentials, because now everything was focused on getting to Sutter's Fort. On September 10th, realizing their situation, 2 volunteers, Charles Stanton, another hero in the Donner story, and William McCutcheon went on ahead to go to Sutter's Fort to raise the alarm and bring back supplies to help the pioneers on their travel. Finally, on September 26th, they rejoined the California Trail. They actually added about a month to their journey by taking the cutoff. They reached the California Trail about 2 months after the decision was made to take the cutoff. And they actually ended up adding about 125 miles to their journey. So you can imagine at this point, they're starting to get desperate. The tempers are getting short, and at the beginning of October, there was an incident involving the Graves family, one of their teamsters, and the Reeds. The wagons became entangled, and a fight ensued. There's a lot of speculation about what really happened, but at the end of the day, James Reed ended up killing John Snyder, the teamster for the Graves family. And everyone was horrified. Snyder was actually a well-loved member of the parties, and Reed had been kind of haughty and pushy, and so they weren't all that excited about giving him a break. People in the party called for his immediate execution. Instead, what they decided to do was they banished him from the party. He still had his family, his wife and his children, and only one wagon with whatever belongings they still had. But Reed set off, and another member of one of his teamsters joined him, and he saw it as his mission to leave and get to Sutter's Fort to let people know what was happening to these Illinois immigrants. By the time Reed leaves and they're pushing towards the Sierra Nevada, it really becomes pandemonium. They're also being harassed along the way by Paiute Indians who are every day picking off some of their livestock, stealing from them. And people are getting desperate. They know they've got to get across the mountains before it snows. So you have this train of people really starting to get extended out, and a lot of concern about what lay ahead. Stanton eventually comes back. He was one of those that had gone ahead to Sutter's Fort. William McCutcheon went with him, became ill and couldn't make the journey. Charles Stanton made it back with about 8 mules, as well as food supplies. And he brought 2 Indians, 2 Native Americans from Sutter's Fort with him to help guide the immigrants. That was towards the end of October. Finally, mid-October, they reached the Truckee River. The Truckee is actually a river that flows out of what is today known as Donner Lake. And they knew they were getting close to the pass of the Sierras, but they had to make a full-on push. In that process, George Donner ends up slicing his hand very badly. He's trying to repair an axle that had broken. So he and his family stay behind while they nurse his wounds and try to help him. The rest of the party pushes on towards the mountains. By Halloween, one of 10 record storms hits the Sierra Nevada, and they are stuck. They realize they're going to have to dig in and prepare to stay the winter. These are farmers. These are not mountain men. These are not hunters. And they really did not know how to provide for themselves. This is an interesting engraving that came out in the 70s, 1870s. It shows a rather tranquil view of Donner Lake. Well, it was something much less than this when they got there. But you can see a couple of the structures that the immigrants built to try to provide themselves shelter. This engraving was also subject of a book plate. I have usually a book plate for the Riverside Library. But the scene at Donner Lake was anything but serene. There was an existing cabin, built 2 years earlier by a member of the Stevens Townsend Murphy party, a fellow named Moses Schallenberger. Had fallen ill, was unable to make it across the mountains. The rest of the people in his party built him this cabin, laid in enough supplies to allow him to make it through the winter. Now, the winter that he survived through at Donner Lake, then known as Truckee Lake, was nothing like what the Donners experienced. And Schallenberger came through it fine. So by the time the Donner Party got to the lake, they were, there was the existing Schallenberger cabin, which the Breen family took possession of. The Graves family built their own cabin about a third of a mile away, closer to what is today Truckee, California. There was also the Murphys built a cabin, kind of more or less a lean-to up against a large rock. That rock is a popular visitor's spot when you visit Donner Lake. Others built small lean-tos. The Keysburgs built a lean-to against the walls of the Breen cabin, formerly the Schallenberger cabin. So they did the best they could at the lake. Unfortunately, for the Donner family, because of George's hand wound, they were delayed. Though they continued to press towards the mountains, they never made it to the lake. One of the ironies is that the Donner Lake, named for those families, the adults in the Donner Party never lived to see the lake. Instead, they found themselves at a place today known as Alder Creek. Conditions there were far worse. They had no pre-existing structures. They had to quickly assemble structures, things like they would overturn their buckboards and put branches and logs up over those, lay pine boughs on those to act as roofs. They had blankets and ox hides they would use for roofs. But it was a pretty desperate situation at Alder Creek. Talked about the storms. As I mentioned, Halloween, the first of 10 major storms went through that area. By the time early November, you already had 10 feet of snow estimated at the pass. It was impossible for the immigrants to cross. It is estimated that at Alder Creek, snow reached as high as 10 to 12 feet. At Donner Lake, as high as 15 to 20 feet, and ultimately at the pass, Donner Pass, 25 plus feet of snow. And you can imagine these are people that had very little in terms of cold weather gear, and their ability to cross was quite compromised. This is a wonderful book that talks about the weather conditions, a lot of estimates based on tree rings, research and things like that. December comes to the camps, and sadly, as supplies dwindle, people start to die. Like I said, the Donners and the rest of them were not hunters. So while they had some success, William Eddy shot a bear early on. There was an occasional deer that was shot. That was about it. And the remaining cattle they had got lost in the snowstorms. So they had very, very little. By December, they're actually eating ox hides. They're boiling the ox hides and trying to turn that into food. One of the problems with that, the ox hides, many of them were used as roofs on their crude cabins. So, but you had a trade-off: shelter, food. So not an enviable position. By December, especially at Alder Creek, things were getting worse. Jacob Donner died early, along with 3 other people. George Donner's hand had become terribly infected. He was not expected to live, and as desperate as things were at the lake camps, Alder Creek was just, it was a terrible place. They had to do something, and so they gathered together and decided they would try to send a small group of people that has become known as the Forlorn Hope Party to cross the mountains to get word to Sutter's Fort of the desperate situation at the camps. Actually, the Graves family, Franklin Graves, who was the patriarch, had some experience in building snowshoes, and so he actually built a number of snowshoes for people that volunteered to go with the Forlorn Hope group. It started out being 17 people, but 2 people very quickly turned back. So ultimately, the party consisted of 15 people, 10 men, 5 women, including the 2 Native Americans that had come from Donner's, from Fort Sutter. They packed enough food supplies, as much as they could, for what they estimated would be a 6-day crossing to get to on the other side of the Sierra, to civilization, and help get word. But meanwhile, at Alder Creek and Donner Lake, conditions just kept getting worse. More people were dying, and they were running out of options. They had not yet started, most people know about the Donner Party as the cannibalism aspect, and we'll talk about that. But they had not resorted to that quite yet. But they were getting desperate. The snow was unrelenting. And they were losing all hope. There was no word from the people that had left. They didn't know what was happening with them. And you can imagine it was a pretty miserable, Christmas. Meanwhile, the folks on the Forlorn Hope Party were making their way, but it was not an easy slog for them. Charles Stanton was one of those that had joined that group. He was the gentleman you remember had gone to Fort Sutter, come back with supplies. He now volunteered to go with the 15 folks to try to get back to Fort Sutter. Sadly, he ends up becoming snowblind, not wanting to delay the others. He volunteers to lay back. He goes, I'll catch up with you later. They found his body when they started the relief efforts. He actually helped guide the relief efforts to the camps. Another one of the tragic figures of the Donner Party. On December 26th, the taboo of cannibalism was discussed. And actually, they decided to engage in eating from the bodies of the dead. The one concession was no one would eat the flesh of a family member. So a few people decided to do that. As you can imagine, there was just horror at the prospect, but it became a necessity. On January 7th, William Eddy actually kills a deer, but that didn't last long. They started discussing, well, maybe, what if we killed the Native Americans and we used them for food? Luis and Salvador caught wind of that. They skedaddled, they got out of there. Unfortunately, they were weakened by what they had been experiencing. And a couple of days later, they were found, they were killed, and their bodies were consumed. Sadly, 3 days later, a local village of Native Americans came across the members of the Forlorn Hope Party and began feeding them what limited stocks of food they had, primarily acorns. But they also brought the survivors of the Forlorn Hope Party to Johnson's Camp, which is about 45 miles east of Sacramento near Marysville. And that is when word got back to Sutter's Fort of the horrors that were happening at the lake. Meanwhile, at the lake and at Alder Creek, nothing was happening. They had no sense of what lay in store for them. When Sutter heard about the horrors and the plight of the immigrants, he started raising money, his own money, offering to form relief parties. Word got to San Francisco. There were big fundraisers to raise money for relief parties to help rescue these poor immigrants. The war with Mexico had just ended, so more people were available. Reed, who had gone trying to raise help, was successful in recruiting people. But the first relief party actually didn't leave until the end of January. But you can imagine the joy when relief finally came to the camps. This is a depiction of that. William Eddy, again, one of my favorites in this telling of the story. He went hoping to find his wife and two young children. Sadly, his wife and daughter had died a few days before. The night before he got there, his son died. But he was still invested in helping save the rest. And James Reed joined the second relief party, and there's a wonderful story of being reunited with members of his family, including his daughter Patty, who was part of the group that was being brought out in the first relief party. You can imagine they had no idea of his fate, and to find him, had to be one of the great and few moments of joy in the telling of the story. But deciding who went with the relief party was not an easy task. You had mothers and fathers having to decide who would stay, who would go. Should they go? Should they stay behind? Ultimately, there were 4 relief parties. The last party to leave was, well, okay, I'm jumping ahead. So, the cannibalism aspect of the Donner story. Cannibalism started with the Forlorn Hope Party, but actually didn't reach the camps. It is suspected that it happened first at Alder Creek, probably towards the end of January. And it didn't happen at the lake until sometime in February. But you can imagine the horror of the people on the relief parties coming across any of the remains and what had happened. As I mentioned, there were 4 relief parties. The third party, when they left, they basically left 3 people behind. George Donner, who was clearly dying from the infection in his hand. His loyal wife, Tamsin, refused to leave his side. She had already sent her children on ahead. And Louis Kiesberg, a German immigrant who had hurt his foot and was unable to walk. When the 4th relief party finally arrived at the camp in mid-April, they found only Louis Kiesberg alive. According to Kiesberg, Tamsin Donner had stayed with her husband. When he died, she left and came to join him. He, by this time, was living in the Breen's cabin. But unfortunately, she passed away the day after she arrived at the lake camp. There was a lot of suspicion towards Kiesberg. He was certainly seen as one of the great villains of the story. His life had to be miserable. He was taunted as the cannibal of the Donner Party and things like that. Ironically, he actually opened a restaurant at one point in Sacramento. That didn't last long. But certainly one of the tragic figures and potentially one of the great villains of the Donner story. It's April 29th. Everyone is out of the mountains. That's the last of the Donners had been rescued. The final tally out of the 87 people that had left, 48 survived, 29 died. Interestingly, 2/3 of the women and children from the party survived. 2/3 of the men died. It has been speculated, like for the women, one of the reasons they survived is they actually, traditionally, they store more body fat, and that helped them actually survive. And they also had the goal of protecting their children. And so there's actually been some interesting studies about that. On June 22nd, Stephen Watts Kearney, famous general, came through what was the remains of the Donner camp, and he ended up cleaning up. And it is said that he took all the remains, had a huge bonfire up against the Murphy cabin. That was the rock that they had built a cabin against, and basically cremated everything that was there. Soon, you can imagine, stories started to emerge. This is a wonderful book that is a compilation of many of the newspaper articles and stories about the Donner Party that was written within a few years of the occurrence. One of the early proponents of preserving the history of the Donner Party was Charles McLaughlin, local newspaper editor in Truckee. McGlashan wrote what is recognized as the first real history of the Donner Party, and he really devoted the rest of his life to the telling of the Donner story. This is a copy of his book, first edition of his book, The History of the Donner Party. One of the things that McGlashan did was he wanted to memorialize the Donners. So in the 1880s, he began raising money for a statue. And if you go to Donner Lake today, you see a large statue. It is actually not specifically for the Donner Party, but it's to honor all of the immigrants who passed that way. But McGlashan had a special affinity for the Donners, and he did what he could to memorialize them. One of the ways he raised money is he created these small artifacts that you can still find today. Look on eBay, things like that. He found a log that had made up the threshold at the Murphy cabin, had not been burned, and he carved it into little pieces, put it in these vials, and sold these to raise money for the statue. As late as the 1980s, you could still buy these vials at Donner Lake. Unfortunately, they don't have them anymore. But as things were typical of the Donner Party, things didn't always go planned, and that included McGlashan's effort to memorialize it. Originally, you'll notice there's a plaque on the front of the statue. Originally, he wanted that plaque to read, "On this spot stood the breeding cabin." Native Sons of the Golden West, who were partners in the effort for the memorial, had that changed to "Near this spot stood the breeding cabin." McGlashan was furious. He knew from all his research that where they were putting the memorial was the spot for the breeding cabin. He ended up publishing a pamphlet, Location of the Breeding Cabin, which is a hearty defense of why that was the spot for the needed for the spot of for the statue. Ultimately, he failed. This is actually one of the harder pieces of Donner ephemera to find. A wonderful story I won't bore you with now. So the Donner Party really moved into the stuff of legends, and in the 1980s, 90s, efforts went underway to really try to preserve the archaeological record of the Donner Party. There were several efforts, one at Murphy Rock, another at Alder Creek, to see what they could find. And that helped define some of what we know about the Donner Party. But there's still efforts underway. I understand there will be more archaeological digs in the future. I'm going to take you through, we're almost at the end. I'm going to just take you through a few of the titles. I told you there were a lot of books. These are some of my favorites. The first one up here actually is the Armed Forces edition of Ordeal by Hunger. You can imagine you're fighting in World War II, you want something light to read, and they give you a copy of Ordeal by Hunger. But, so that's that. The books that you'll see, these titles, they have run the gamut. From full-on novels, fiction, epic poems, as was said. This one, Sex and Death in the Western Immigrant Trail, actually tackles the issue of why do women have higher survival rates. Children's fiction, a lot of children's fiction. Graphic novels. These are a couple of biblical histories on the Donner Party. Probably one of my favorite titles the story of Itchy Donner, a fictional survivor or descendant of the Donner family. Science fiction. Have to have a good bodice ripper, you know, about the Donner family. Epic poems. Why have just one? Why not two or three? Screenplays. The Donner Party musical is an interesting one, as well as the Tamsin Donner Blues Band. A good table game, Donner Party. Since I gave this talk in 2019, there have been at least 9 other books that have come out in which the Donner Party plays a central role. Most of them are fiction. This one, The Deadliest Shortcut, actually looks interesting. I'll probably be picking that one up. It's a modern retracing of the Hastings Cutoff, which I think sounds interesting. Finally, we're at the end. And I know it's time for dinner, so I wanted to suggest, if you're looking for some recipes, the Donner Party cookbook might be a suggestion. You might even, if you want to have a full-on Donner Party dinner, don't forget your best Donner Party china, and maybe even a bottle of Donner Party wine, red, of course. Love the slogan, good friends, good food. And lastly, our friend Gary Larson always enjoyed cartoons about the Donner Party, and here are just a couple. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Don't go anywhere. We're going to have some time for some questions.
Good.
So hang out right here. Let's start here in the audience. Do we have any questions for our speaker? You could be over at the microphone. I'm pretty loud. Any questions from the audience? Sure, we'll start over here. Nick.
It's my understanding that Lansford Hastings never actually traveled his cutoff.
Well, as I said, and I kind of hurried through that, he hadn't done it prior to writing his guide.
Right.
He actually left to test his theory around the same time as the Donners and the Reeds left Springfield. So he had crossed through, and but he went with Jim Clayman, I think, and Clayman was saying this is not a viable route, but he still wanted to encourage migration. So he basically still encouraged the Donners to pass. But you're right. Prior to writing his book, he never had done it.
So did he suffer any contemporary criticism after the tragedy?
Not really. He kind of got lost in the shuffle because of the end of the Mexican War, California statehood. But like I said, he actually left California. So the Donners wrapped up in 47. He was in Arizona by 1850. So I assume that probably did hasten his retreat from California. And then he, got good decisions, joined the Confederacy. So,
We're going to take another question, but we're going to repeat the question for the Zoom audience, so they can't hear what's happening there. So
Okay.
let's, Dennis.
And the microphone.
And be closer to the microphone. Yeah.
So what were the first printed accounts? Were they in newspapers, and have you collected any of that material?
that book I showed, The Unfortunate Immigrants.
Let's repeat the question.
Oh,
So what were the first printed accounts of the Donner Party ordeal? And were they in newspapers, I think was the question, or
Yeah.
books, or where did they appear? That's okay.
local newsprint, often focused on the sensational. But the book I mentioned by Kristen Johnson, Unfortunate Immigrants, came out probably about 15 years ago now. But it's a compilation of a lot of those first early stories of the Donner Party. So, but McGlashan is seen as the guy who really popularized the understanding of what happened.
Yes.
So Hastings' book was, Immigrant's Guide, was used by a lot. Had John C. Fremont's books of his first expeditions, which I understood got a lot of Americans excited about making this trip, had they come out already? And did they help fuel the fire, or?
Let's recap that question.
Well, basically, what role did the books of John Fremont on immigration, encouraging immigration to California play versus the role that the Hastings book? I gave you a little time to stall and try to come up with an answer. I don't know. I think Fremont's books came out afterwards, so I suspect they probably had a little bit of a role, but quite honestly, I don't think any of the books did as much to encourage migration to California as the gold rush did 2 years later. So, and that's really what sparked the migration to California.
So we have a question here from Zoom that says, where did the surviving immigrants live out their lives? Did they ever try again and to get to California? Did they get to California?
Well, you had the people that reached Sutter's Fort, and they then dispersed, most of them throughout California. The city of Marysville is actually named after Mary Donner. A lot of them went to the San Jose area and restarted their lives. Many of them remarried. William Eddy, I talked about. He actually remarried twice. And he actually went back east after his third marriage. But many of them stayed in California. I mean, they basically lost everything. They really didn't have the means to reclaim what they had in Illinois. And so they really just had to start from scratch.
So Alice wants you to tell the story of finding the hardest to find piece of ephemera that you didn't tell. And what were there other ones that were really hard to find?
There were others that were more difficult. None more sought after than the pamphlet Location of the Green Cabin. I had heard about it. I had actually seen a copy at the museum at Donner Lake and was just very obsessed by it. I had looked for many, many years, probably 15, 20 years. A good friend of mine introduced me to a book dealer and basically said, they can find anything. And so it was James and Mary from Carpe Diem Books, if you guys know them. And they took on the challenge. Well, for probably the next 7, 8 years, whenever I would run into them at a book fair, I would just presumptively go up and say, oh, I'm here to collect my Donner pamphlet. And they never had luck. Finally, my wife gets a desperate call. James calls the house, I need to talk to Jim, I need to talk to him right away. He had some guy, he then had a bookshop in Monterey. He had someone just come in off the street with a box or two full of stuff, all related to the Donner Party. There had been an article written for Brand Magazine, and this stuff had come from that author's research. And as luck would have it, at the very bottom of the last box, there, lying in pristine condition, is this brochure. And James knew immediately he had to get a hold of me, called me. What do you want to do? I said, well, let's buy it, find out. Unfortunately, the guy with the box didn't want to sell it just piecemeal. He wanted to sell the whole thing. And James was unable to strike a deal. So, that led to a few more years of teasing about, well, where's my pen? And finally, I got another call from him saying, you'll never guess what happened. The guy came back. He's now willing to sell. And after what I want to say is 15 to 20 years of working with James on trying to find that pamphlet, he said, how much are you willing to pay? I gave him the price. Being a good bookseller, he goes, that's exactly what I was thinking. And we ended up doing the deal, and I'm pleased to have it. I've never seen another.
Someone asks about the Diary of John Markle. Are you familiar with that?
No, tell me about that.
Oh, okay. It says,
No, I'm not familiar.
okay. Well, maybe we'll follow up on that
Yeah.
later. And then John asks, clearly there are still books being published on the Donner Party. You mentioned some of the latest ones. Are these based on new discoveries and research, or are they just rehashing what we already
For the
know?
most part, they're rehashing. And most of them are fiction. Most of them, a lot of them focus on the sensational, which I think is really doesn't do justice to the story, to be quite honest. It is part of the story, you can't avoid it. But it was such an epic tale that there's far more to the Donner Party story. There are some newer books. There was a book a couple of years ago, This Side of Heaven or something. It was a good modern telling of the history. And then there's a book like the one I pointed out of some modern day hikers that decided to hike the Hastings Cutoff. While not related to the Donner Party specifically, I think that would be an interesting read to understand what that area looks like today.
Do we have any other questions here in the audience? Go ahead.
On the weather, you said record 10 storms. Would this be what we used to call the Pineapple Express and is now an atmospheric river? Or was this
That's a good question. I was never very good with predicting the weather, let alone studying it. But I suspect, it was a freak event. It was not something that was anticipated. Normally, they get 2 or 3 big storms through that area this year, and like I said, they had 10. And you look at this last winter; we've already had several big storms go through that area. So I think that's a reasonable conclusion.
So I have a couple questions here that
All
I'm
right.
going to ask you. Have you ever exhibited your collection?
No, well,
Other than on in
Yeah.
PowerPoint, you've
Yeah.
never actually installed an exhibition.
no.
We might want to talk about that.
Okay.
And then, where is your collection eventually going to go? Have you thought about
Ask my wife.
where that might be, like a museum, a university?
I haven't
Any
thought.
thoughts?
I thought if there was possibly a university, if that would happen. None of the books, with the exception of maybe a couple of them, are particularly rare. It is just an uncommonly large accumulation.
A complete
Yeah,
selection.
yes, it is.
So, okay, then the last question that I'll ask is, is there one book that listeners should try to find, read, if they want to know more about the entire?
Yeah, if we can just real quickly jump to here, I've got it here. Like I said, I would probably recommend this recent book that just came out a few years ago. Just a lousy titles. Best Land Under Heaven by Michael Walden. It was published in 2017. I think it's a pretty good telling of the story. It has a lot of background information as well as the story of what happened along the way. But I probably learned more about the journey on the California Trail and stuff like that from that book than I had others. So I probably recommend that.
So that was The Best Land Under Heaven.
Yes.
This is a book you'll
Right.
recommend that
Yeah.
folks pick up. Great. Well, on that note, we'll end our presentation today. And how about a big round of applause for our speakers? So, thanks again to our speaker, Jim Hier, and to you for attending this Book Club of California program. Our next program will be Monday, February 27th. It's in a couple of weeks from now because there's a holiday in there and then Valentine's Day. So our next program is a virtual program. You can participate from anywhere. It's titled Cover Treasure, The Life and Art of Margaret Armstrong. It's going to be presented by author and collector Lowell Thing. You can register for this event online at bccbooks.org/programs or any of the emails that you might be receiving from the Book Club of California. We always have links to register for all of our events in there. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you at another Book Club of California event. Woo!